Before we get into our discussion, it's important for us to state that the Higher Education Reform Experts South Africa is a European Union-funded project. The views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of our guests and our guests alone. They do not represent or reflect the official policy or position of HERESA or the member institutions and organizations by whom our guests are employed. Unless otherwise stated, HERESA does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, view, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in the HERESA podcast. Welcome to the HERESA podcast, where we'll have engaging, stimulating, and hopefully worthwhile conversations on issues, themes, and concerns in higher education. My name is Kanya Mjadli, and I am the Media Liaison Officer for Technological Higher Education Network South Africa, or THENSA, which is a coalition of technology-focused institutions based in South Africa. I'll be the host of this conversation, but in future we'll have a number of other hosts featured on the HERESA podcast. For those of you who aren't in the know, HERESA is an Erasmus Plus capacity building project for higher education, which THENSA established in partnership with Orbial Global Observatory in Spain and the South African Qualifications Authority, or SAQA. As a pilot project that will take place over 3 years in THENSA's member institutions, HERESA seeks to build a network of higher education reform experts in South Africa based on the Higher Education Reform Experts model in the EU neighborhood. This edition of the HERESA podcast is part of a new series we're running titled Young Academics in the Age of COVID-19. This project seeks to trigger conversation amongst young academics from HERESA's member institutions around the challenges they face during this pandemic. Through the use of dialogue-inspired learning, the Young Academics podcast endeavours to discover how each of our guests have dealt with the various restrictions put in place by the government, what they have learned from the transition to online and remote teaching and learning, and what higher education institutions can do to better prepare themselves for future pandemics and disasters. We hope that this medium can provide a platform for the experiences and voices of early to mid-career academics. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing the 5 academics who will be joining us for the 3rd episode of the Young Academics podcast. First up, we have Mr. Alata Ndlebe, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Accounting at Walter Sisulu University. We then have Dr. F.O. Makananise, who is a senior lecturer in media studies at the University of Venda. We also have Ms. Kutso Mabokela, who is also a fellow lecturer in media studies at the University of Venda. Then we have Ms. Xoliswa Faiki, an NGAP lecturer in civil engineering and geomatics at the Durban University of Technology. And rounding up our panel for today is Ms. Rosa Nodia Potgieter, a lecturer in tourism management from the Tshwane University of Technology. Young academics, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, Kanya.
Of course. In our previous episode, we had a number of young academics who felt that hybridization was the direction in which teaching and learning at higher education institutions was headed, during this strange post, but not quite post-pandemic era. But before we get into what the future of higher education institutions could potentially look like, I think it's important for our listeners to get a sense of how things were for lecturers when COVID-19 first hit. So I guess the first question I'd like to pose to all of you is, what were your immediate responses when institutions announced that they would be transitioning from in-person teaching to online and remote teaching modalities? We'll start with Ms. Rosa Nodia Potgieter.
So I think I've got a very unique situation on my side, but because I actually only started lecturing last year, January. So coming out from corporate world, and I joined TUT the 1st of January 2021. So it was a total shock for my system. I don't know what the old TUT looks like, but I walked in with COVID. Started at the university, immediately starting with online lecturing, a lot of online systems that I had to get to know, I haven't still, up to now, I still have not met my whole team that I'm working with. I've barely seen some of my students. So it's been a crazy time for me.
Wow. Ms. Fakey, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, thank you very much. I must say that the first thing that I think I experienced was shock and panic. But because we were already using an online platform to share materials with our students. So the only transition that had to happen was to teach online and have assessments online. But I must say that the university had a very strong support team, and they were there for us all the way. So it was shocking, but at least there was support. Thank you.
Right. And then we'll go on to Ms. Mabokela.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. Well, I would like to agree with the previous speaker. Yes, transitioning to virtual learning, 100% virtual learning was quite nerve-wracking because, yes, our institution also had already implemented learning management systems such as Blackboard and Moodle. So we were partially, acquainted with those technological learning tools. But now the challenge was having to now implement the tools 100% from home. So this was kind of a bit of a nerve-wracking experience because now we were forced to, navigate through the systems. We were forced to now fully use those learning management systems. Yeah, so I'd say in a nutshell, the experience was quite nail-biting. Thank you.
Right. And then Dr. Makana Nise, and then we'll go to Mr. Ndlebe.
Thank you very much, Kanya. I would like to actually agree with my colleagues because looking at the background that we're actually educated through, face-to-face kind of, a system. And all of a sudden we have to transition to the online kind of, teaching and learning. It was really a worrisome kind of a situation. But, my immediate response actually to that was actually to start thinking about how possible to actually plan my teaching and learning online, because even though the University of Venda had that kind of a system, the Blackboard system in place, we were not really fully using it. We used to post materials, we used to post study guide and so on, but now you have to think hard in order to engage students so that they can actually learn something out of what you'll be teaching them. So the experience was really, nerve-breaking, as my colleagues are saying, I could say, but with time we managed to adapt. That's my input. Thank you.
And then Mr. Ndlebe.
Thanks, Kanya. Most institutions had LMSs. The main concern on my side was how to keep engaged with the students and make sure that the teaching and learning is interactive so that they don't lose momentum and that they keep motivated. So those were my immediate responses as soon as this emergency remote teaching and learning came about. Thanks.
Right. I mean, I think I had a bit of trouble hearing you, Mr. Ndlebe, so we'll have to come back to you another time just so we kind of captured everything that you said. But I'll go on to my next question. Some of you have mentioned the fact that you didn't necessarily get the opportunity to even engage with your colleagues because you started teaching when the pandemic hit. But I guess a question that I have is, did any of you engage in discussions at your institutions or just informally amongst colleagues about your preparedness for this transition? Could you describe the nature of those discussions? I've heard the terms shock, I've heard the terms nerve-wracking, but could you characterize, those discussions for us? I think I'll give it to Ms. Fakey.
Thank you for the opportunity, ma'am. I must say, when COVID hit the first time, I don't think any of us, before we adjusted, we were thinking about anything. We are all in shock because we're thinking we're gonna die, and then after that, you need now to kind of adjust and kind of find out where people are. But in general, it was difficult. Even when you are communicating with your colleagues, we were all in a space whereby it's kind of difficult, but we are trying to grasp as much as we can of whatever it is that is being offered. In my university, they used to have different workshops. Sometimes you attend the workshop because they will be dealing with assessments. Sometimes you join, they help you find out how you can engage your students and everything. But in general, I think it was kind of difficult because you have to adapt. People on their own corners as well, they're trying to do the same. So it was honestly difficult, but from the university, the support was there. And then we did have those platforms of communication.
Right. I think I will give the floor to Mr. Ndlebe now.
Thank you, Kanya. Can you hear me?
Can hear you perfectly fine.
Thank you. We did also engage in discussions amongst the colleagues about our preparedness. We had student protests before, so we were somewhat prepared for an emergency remote learning, but we were not well prepared. I think there was far more uncertainty this time, and I think the consequences of this remote teaching and learning were far more than a few weeks because of student protests. So we did have engagements, but certainly we weren't quite that prepared.
Thank you. I think I will ask Snoda Potrita to offer her contributions, given that, you mentioned that you started teaching last year. So I'm keen to know whether you had an opportunity to reach out to colleagues and how that was like, having not met them.
So yeah, I definitely had to reach out a lot because I basically knew nothing. I was absolutely clueless. And it was comforting to hear the other lecturers that they were going exactly through the same emotions that I was going through, even though they were long-serving lecturers. So that did give me some comfort that I wasn't alone on this journey and doing it on my own.
Right. I guess my next question has been answered to some extent because I think many of you have mentioned just how much of a challenge this transition was. But I guess, besides the fact that this was all new and besides the fact that you had to implement these learning tools that perhaps hadn't been used that much at your institutions, what else was challenging about this transition? Perhaps what is something that was challenging that perhaps people might not immediately think of, when they think about lecturers dealing with COVID? I think I will give this to Dr. Makananise.
Thank you very much, Kanya. Given my context, what was very much challenging was actually to make sure that proper knowledge and understanding has been put across to the students to learn, and also to grade the students. It was a bit of a challenge because, as I've indicated before, we were used to the traditional way of assessing students, and now you have to transit into the the virtual way or the online way, the system of actually assessing the student. And it was quite of a challenge in order to, can you say, I have successfully graded my students and they can actually proceed to another level, or they can do another assessment, and so on and so on and so forth. But hence I'm saying that, Kanya, the issue was in terms of making sure or trying to find out whether students have learned something in what I was teaching. It became a serious problem or a serious challenge in terms of that assessment that they have to write, especially online. Students, do teach cheating, and sometimes you ask, it's like in our context, or in my context in media studies, we don't ask one-word answers. We need some explanation. We need students to actually elaborate on certain theories and elements that they have learned in class. So students will just copy and paste what they have learned or what is there on the study guide or in the book and regurgitate it back to you or bring it back to you. So it became a serious challenge in terms of assessment to can actually be proud as a lecturer to say, really my students are progressing well. I'm rest assured that this is the marks or the grades that they deserve. So assessment became a serious challenge for me. Thank you.
Ms. Mabokela.
Okay, thank you so much, Kanya. Well, I couldn't agree more with my colleague. Well, yes, challenges such as students cheating, because him and I are from the same department. So like he has mentioned, we set essay type of questions. So whereby we needed students to, explain in depth of their understanding, theories and all of that. But before I can go into the challenge of assessment, my worry or my biggest, challenge was that were the students well equipped enough to, utilize all these resources? Like, were they well equipped to use the LMS, all these systems that were provided by the institution? Were they able to access my lectures? Were they able to access the notes? Because yes, my institution, did support. We had workshops for for the students. We also had workshops for the lecturer. But, prior to the pandemic, even us as educators, we did not take all those, workshops, the LMS, Blackboard, Moodle workshops seriously. So some of my colleagues were not really acquainted with all these tools. So number one, were the students able to use the systems? Number two, the assessment, yes. And one other thing, which is an issue that is currently facing the country as a whole, was, the digital divide, the inequity. Yes, now the kids will now be at home, but will they be able to have, access to the internet, considering that I am from a rural-based university. So this was, quite worrisome on my side, that yes, we might have these lectures online, but the issue of access, the issue of connectivity was also, played a major role in all of that. Thank you.
I'm so happy you mentioned that, and this might be somewhat of a surprise question, because there were so many conversations around the digital divide in South Africa during the pandemic. We've known that our infrastructure doesn't necessarily provide for the kind of access that we see at institutions abroad, but it became something that was at the forefront of discussions around access and inequality in higher education institutions. So I guess my question to all of you would be, how do you as a lecturer deal with the fact that there are some of your students who can't necessarily participate as much as they would like because of these inequalities and because of this lack of access? Is there a powerlessness that comes over you, in the context of trying to prepare these lessons, trying to make sure that there's a transfer of knowledge, but also realizing that there's only so much you can do? I think I'll give this question, we'll start maybe with Mr. Ndlebe first, and we'll go through all of you.
Thanks, Kanya. Definitely there is a powerlessness that you feel because you're not in charge of the resource distribution, whether or not students have devices, data, or where students actually reside. But I think in dealing with it, there's an element of just being understanding of the student's situation and maybe being a bit more flexible when interacting and dealing with students, and even in terms of the platforms that you use or make available for interaction and dealing with students. And I think that was the approach that I took in trying to deal with this digital divide issue. Thank you.
Dr. Makalaniza, do you have anything to add? All right, we'll move on to his colleague, Ms. Mabokela.
Well, yes, we had to, be fluid at one point. The concept or the element of flexibility, as my previous colleague has mentioned, was very pivotal in, in making sure that all students are on track, they're on the same page and all of that. So you would incorporate, at times you would you would just be so lenient. At times, you would just tell them that, no, it's fine. You can submit the assignment a day in later, or, you would just improvise here and there just to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And also at times, they would just call you, or other times I would also use my email, because our LMS systems would at times be down. They would just say, my phone can't connect to Blackboard or Moodle. So, ma'am, can I just send it to you via your email? Or at times we even use, platforms such as WhatsApp. So the concept or the element of fluidity, was pivotal in all of this. Thank you.
Right. And then Ms. Fakey.
Okay, thank you. On our side, I definitely agree with my colleagues. It was difficult because you were not in control. But one of the things that I think worked for us when we realized that now we have a problem with the connectivity, some students did not even have laptops. So what would happen is, instead of having a session whereby you teach, then we would have pre-recorded videos, and then students can come back to them later. So in the MS Teams sessions that we would have, it would be for discussion based on the video that was already posted. So in that way, even if a student at that particular moment, they don't have data or they can't access the material, but later they can, and then we come back and discuss. For us, I think that helped us a lot to make sure that all students get the information. But now and then you would get students sending you emails or calling, and then on your side, then you have to understand that the assignment cannot be submitted now, maybe expected in 2 days or a day later. It's okay, but that's what we had to go through.
Right. And then Ms. Node Potgieter.
Yeah, I have to say I agree with everybody on what they did. Definitely feel sorry for the students and what they had to go through. What I experienced, sorry, there is 2 babies in the background, is the fact that your personal time got impacted because I had to make my WhatsApps available to them, and now you've got 200 students that's got access to your personal cell phone number because I'm really just trying to help them.
Yeah, I think that kind of segues into my next question, which is about workloads. Last year, a study conducted by the Council on Higher Education, University South Africa, and the University of the Free State, amongst 1,851 academic staff at 24 public universities, found that 75% of respondents stated that their workloads had increased in this transition. Ms. Node Potgieter mentioned the infiltration of her personal WhatsApp, which doesn't necessarily feel like work, but is work. It feels as though you have all this extra work to do. So how, if at all, have your workloads increased? I'll give this to Dr. Makana Nisa. I don't know if he's back with us.
Yes, I'm back, Kanya.
Excellent.
I was cut a little bit. What I can say actually, Kanya, about this, the study, results are 100% accurate. I can really, agree with the result of this study, because as some of the colleagues also mentioned here, during actually this time of pandemic, we had a lot to do. Number one, I had to make sure that I'm attending to the students' queries any time of the day, because the students had my personal number on the WhatsApp group. We created a WhatsApp group, and when they've got issues and so on, you'll be forced to actually respond any time of the day. And work will never end, with this, when you're working, under these kind of circumstances, because especially when it comes to the issue of assessing students. I'll go back to it because it's very much important. You will find yourself marking scripts or students' assessments online even at night, because marking online, I'm telling you, it's hectic. than actually doing it manually. I've learned it through all these 2 years that have been, that we've been working online, that it's very terrible. We're working online, grading students online, making sure that you put the mark, you put the comments and so on, one by one. It's really hectic. We sleep 3 a.m. in the morning to make sure that at least we push and meet the deadline. Gosh. So in terms of that was a very serious issue in terms of the workload that is added, because working online has been that terrible. So another issue, the other issue is that now, because students are flooding on your emails, students are flooding on your WhatsApp, you no longer even have time for yourself. You no longer even have time for your family. You're working from home. You're expected to every time attend to students. It's not like when you are physically on campus, because I will have consultation hours where they will come during this time of the day and then they leave. But when you're working online, you have to be available for those students, to assist them, to attend to their queries, to attend to the issues where they are raising, and so on and so forth. So workload has increased. And also, I could also mention, Kanya, in 1 second, that previously, because we're doing face-to-face kind of a work, some of us, we didn't even have the study guides. We're not using the study guides. We used to go to class, I got the prescribed book, and then I would teach using the prescribed book. But a lot of work, we had to put a lot of work now into producing study guides for for all the modules. Maybe I've got 3 modules for the whole semester. So that was quite a challenge on itself. The work was so much in order to make sure that the students get the knowledge that they need. I will pause here just for now and give others a chance. Thank you, Kanya.
Right. I mean, I heard a lot of agreeing. Does anyone have anything else to add here?
Oh, no, he has said a mouthful. Yes, grading online, oh my goodness, that can be such a nightmare. Getting to spend actually the whole day on the laptop, your eyes would just be exhausted by the end of the day. Then yes, accessibility, the students have access to you 24/7. They do not care if it's midnight. If they have something they need to address with you, they text. So they were just invading our personal spaces. And one other thing was that the workload increased because we were now, assisting students with time management, because now they're at home, how ill-disciplined they can be. So we now have to make sure that they prioritize their time, consciously. And one other thing that I can just quickly mention was the fact that we as educators, we were now filling in the gaps from the system. When they send all these communicating, our communiques, the correspondences of how far are we with classes and all of that. So we had to keep our students abreast on such things. So they would just ask you questions all the time. So if one student would come, ask the same thing, so it was just a nightmare.
I guess what I'm getting from these responses is, not only did you have to do your academic work, not only did you have to be present as a lecturer, but there was also this kind of emotional support, or you kind of had to fulfill the role of an institution, or the support networks that are present at an institution. And I think that kind of brings me to my next question, which is about work-life balance. That was such a major talking point in conversations about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. And from what I'm hearing, it seems as though it was virtually impossible to strike a balance between the personal and professional. I've heard about students infiltrating WhatsApps. I've heard about students, messaging or emailing at odd hours of the evening. Was there ever a time where you were able to strike the boundary? Was there ever a time where you were able to assert your boundaries and say, look, I'm not available 24/7? Or was it just, coping with the situation because it was new? I'll give this to Ms. Fakey.
Thank you very much. I don't think the balance existed at all. The thing is, students will email you, even if you say don't send anything after this time. What happens is students always send. So the thing, what you need to do yourself is tell yourself at 5, I'm switching off the computer. Then that's the only way, because if you open it immediately when you do that, they are there. And another thing is we used to, and we still do, get emails from students, because students panicked, and then when they panic, you are their support system, because there's no one else. You could get emails about their personal lives, everything that is difficult, that because the method of assessment had to change as well, because they can't cheat anymore. So there's a way we need to kind of shift so that we ask questions in a different way. They panic and they ask you, how are questions going to be directed to us? All the things that have to do with assessment. Now you need to answer all those questions whenever they want you. So it was honestly difficult to balance, feeling that I'm not prepared enough. I will panic. There was that panic, and the balance, I think I'm only getting it now, whereby I'm at a place where I'm like, okay, now I have this under control. But from 2019 until last year, I don't think there was any balance. It was difficult.
I'll give it to Mr. Ndlebe to add on.
Thanks, Kanya. Definitely, I think work-life balance didn't really exist. I think the lines were really blurred, especially because you're working from home. So if you're working from office, there's normally structure in that, once you leave home, you've left home, you're at work. When you leave work, you've left work, you're at home, unless when you've got some urgent stuff to do. But now you're at home the whole time, so it's very hard to draw the line. When does work time end? And when does leisure time begin? And I think, as my colleagues have mentioned, it was similar for the students, because they would be contacting you at 2 a.m. in the morning, sending you emails, indicating that they were also struggling with this work-life balance issue. So I think, the lines were very blurred because we're working from home, made it very difficult. Thanks.
Ms. Node Potgieter?
Yeah, I totally agreed. Maybe coming from the other side, especially in lockdown periods and working from home, most of us have kids. I've got 2 newborn twins. So trying to do all the admin and work while still looking after our kids and trying to cook food was definitely challenging, definitely.
Yeah. I guess I'm curious to find out whether all these changes, all this sort of abrupt kind of chaos that was happening during the last 2 years of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm curious to know whether it affected your teaching style in any way. Were you ever in a position where you tried to implement different pedagogical approaches in an effort to kind of pivot and adjust to these changes, or maybe use it as an opportunity to do something you hadn't done before? I think I'll give this to Dr. Makalanise.
Thank you very much, Kanya. When you change in terms of the setup of teaching, it actually affects your teaching philosophy. And from my personal point of view, I experienced that change and using different, teaching, approaches. Because during the traditional mode of teaching and learning and so on, where we've got face-to-face kind of an interaction, you will find that it's easier in order for you to use the kind of deep learning approach or the surface learning approach and so on, which are some of them, the approaches that are there of learning and teaching and learning. So when now we have moved to the virtual kind of conducting the lectures and so on. So it becomes difficult in order to use that, because there are a lot of things that are involved. There's an issue of data involved, there's an issue of power, electricity involved, there's an issue of gadgets involved, and so on and so forth. So keeping students, also focused when they don't see you or you don't see each other, it's quite, it was quite a problem for me. So, but I had to change from using the approaches that I was applying or using during the face-to-face kind of learning approaches, and then I had to move and adapt to certain kinds of teaching approaches where now I'm using group assignments, where I'm using, kind of short presentations where students will come. Even though they were not working effectively, which was student-centered, because I was now using more of student-centered approach for their participation so that they can participate. And they didn't want to have ghost students that I'm not sure whether they are there or they're just logged in there somewhere. So I will try to engage them. So my approach was more on student-centered kind of an approach where students are engaging and making sure that when we meet next time, there are 5 students who have to present on a certain topic and then we listen to them. So that's the kind of, the shift that happened or, during the time of teaching online. Thank you.
Of course. If you don't mind, colleagues, I'm going to move on to our next question just so everybody has a chance to respond. In your view, how can institutions better prepare academics and learners for future pandemics and disasters? I know Mr. Ndlebe mentioned that emergency online and remote teaching was something that his institution was accustomed to implementing given the protests that had happened there. But, do you believe that there needs to be a reskilling or upskilling of digital and pedagogical approaches at institutions for academics and learners? Or do you think it's more or less a case of, academics and learners really making use of the existing technologies or sort of digital systems available at institutions as it stands? I'll give this to Ms. Mabogela.
Okay, thank you so much, Kanya. Well, yes, we definitely need to upskill or reskill, upgrade. Yes. So what I would suggest is for institutions to ensure that all these workshops, all these e-learning lessons become compulsory to both educators and learners. So if you are a student at a certain institution, e-learning should be one of those modules. That's a core module. So you can't say, this would be an elective for me. So it should be, core in order for us to be prepared for, in inverted commas, future pandemics. And also even us with educators, I believe we need to move with the times because, the government has always been talking about introducing the 4IR and all of that, the Industrial Revolution where things had to now be done digitally. So I think the pandemic was more of a wake-up call to us as educators and learners to know that, such unprecedented times, can happen, and we need to be well equipped. We need to be ready. We need to move with the times. Digital is, the new normal. So technology should be introduced in all these institutions for both educators and students. Thank you.
Ms. Node Potgieter.
Hi there. Sorry. We saw a lot of benefit in hybrid teaching with students. And I think students from the beginning should be made accustomed to hybrid teaching so that when we have to switch over to total online classes again, that it is not such a big impact and that they are already used to it.
Right. Ms. Fakey?
I do agree with my colleagues. I believe that we should continue with blended learning, even if things go back to normal, but let's keep the blended learning in place. That way, students have both. They have things that they need to do online and things that they need to do on campus. That way, when there's an emergency as well, then we are already eating. Thank you.
And then I'll give it to Mr. Ndlebe and then Dr. Makhananise.
Thanks, Kanya. I think the colleagues have covered it. I think really what we need to do is to just make sure that blended learning is happening at all times so that when a transition needs to happen to online, it's not such a hard transition. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you, Kanya. I agree with my colleagues that blended learning actually has to continue. And institutions have to actually invest much on e-learning to make sure that both lecturers and also learners or students are well equipped in terms of these new technologies that we're using. And not only that, also the government needs to support in terms of making sure that there are enough, technological equipments that are needed in order to execute our job or to do our work as academics. Thank you very much.
Great. And then my final question, as institutions kind of implement blended learning, hybridization, what are some of the lessons that you've learned as an educator, and how do you plan to implement them going forward? What are some of the things that have stayed with you having navigated this very unprecedented time? I'll start with Ms. Nodea Potgieter. Okay, I'll take it to Ms. Fakey.
Okay, for me, I will say that we, as universities, we honestly need to understand who we are teaching. By that, I mean, you need to understand your students, because when COVID hit, that was the only time universities are worried about who are our students, can they afford this, can they not afford that, and everything. So I think moving forward, it's important that we know who our students are and what are their needs, so that in anything that we plan or we try to implement, we know that they're included and students don't feel left out, or they feel like they're disadvantaged in cases of having to transition blended learning or online learning. I believe that we honestly need to cater for our students' need, and we can only do so by understanding who are our students. Thank you.
Ms. Mabokela.
Thank you, Kanya. Well, the lesson that I believe I have learned from this experience was that we need to be forever ready. We need to make use of whatever technological tools are, at our disposal, because I'm not trying to sound all political, but, considering the fact that our institution has implemented, e-learning workshops and all of that, but we were not taking them seriously. We only took them seriously, when we like in the pandemic, we had no choice. It's like, now I don't have a choice but to use it. So all these platforms have been at our disposal, but we just, I don't know, we're not incognizant of them, if I may say. So a lesson that I would say I've learned is that we must always be ready. We must always research more and, not be afraid of change, Thank you.
Mr. Ndlebe, then Dr. Makananis.
Thanks, Kanya. I think from a teaching and learning perspective, two things that I think I will take forward with me is one, that there are things that are better done online than face-to-face. I find that for things like small assessments, like pre-reading tests and objective tests, using self-grading quizzes online is so much more effective and efficient. Also for interacting with students, I find that online discussion forums are far more beneficial than one-to-one consultations. And then from a personal career perspective, I think one of the things that I've learned that I'll take forward is that there are so many resources out there to learn from as academics, and we should make the most of them. And I think if we don't capacitate ourselves, then then we are not going to thrive in the future. Thanks.
Dr. Makananis.
Thank you, Kanya. I could actually say that as young academics, if our institutions actually, they would like to capacitate us and also to train us, in end learning and so on, we should take that serious, because actually I want to agree with some of my colleagues who said that when such kind of trainings are called in some instances, before we can even move to this kind of blended learning or online learning, we could ignore that. We never, saw that coming, that it will be a need in the future or in the next year or so forth and so forth. So when now it became the reality, it was really hitting on the nerve to say that I need to use this, but I've never attended these kind of trainings and so on. And now in a short space of time, where trainings are being done in a week, 5 trainings in a week. I want to actually make sure that I absorb everything. I know everything at a go and so on, which was impossible. So I could actually also say that the institutions should make sure that they know their context, they know where they are operating from, they know their students. I want to agree with with the other colleague who said that they should know who their students are, where they are operating from, and so on. So is this thing going to be possible so that we can have an online learning and so on and so forth? And I would also want to say, I would like to also agree that we should continue with blended learning because it is beneficial. It has its benefits, even though it has its own, hiccups here and there. Thank you very much.
And then I'm going to try Ms. Node Potgieter one more time.
I was just agreeing with the second gentleman on his suggestions. But I think, just a challenge for us as lecturers to get our minds right. I agree with the last speaker now that hybrid or share online and physical classes is the new way to go. And everybody must just get their heads right. Both avenues has got the advantages, disadvantages, and use it to the best of our ability both ways.
Excellent. I think that's our time for today, young academics, but I would like to thank each and every one of you for your time today. I'd like to thank you for your contributions, for your openness and your honesty. And I'd like to commend you for having made it out of one of the difficult, or arguably the most difficult period, not just for higher education institutions, but our world. Your responsibilities, to educate a cohort of young people is quite intense, and I think you should commend yourselves for having handled it to the best of your ability. So thank you so much for your time today, and I wish all of you the very best in your careers going forward.
Thank you, Kanya.
Thank you, Kanya.
Thank you, Kanya.
Thank you for your time, colleagues.